Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar about travel as bridge building, rethinking Russia. My name is Sandra Reimer, and I work with TourMagination on their communication. As you know, TourMagination helps people of faith explore, experience, and expand their worlds. Today, we have the privilege of having Len Friesen, one of our very favorite tour leaders, talk to us about Russia, his travels there, understanding of stereotypes, and how we can rethink those as North Americans. Before I turn the webinar over to Len, I'm going to introduce him to you. Len Friesen is a history professor and the founding chair of the Global Studies program at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario. He holds a PhD from the University of Toronto and is the author of several books, including Transcendent Love, Dostoevsky, and the Search for a Global Ethic. He and Mary Burkholder have been married since 1977. Together, they have 3 adult children, 2 in-laws, and 5 grandchildren. Len has led tours across Europe, Russia, and Ukraine, and to South Africa, many of these with TourMagination. I'll now turn the webinar over to Len.
Well, thank you, Sandra, for that introduction. Every time I hear an introduction to me, it always makes me think it's a eulogy, and then I'm always grateful that it's not a eulogy because I still have more or less what looks like a pulse. I'm delighted to be here and to join you and to talk a little bit about Russia and travel to Russia. It's a tour we're doing in May. Mary and I are in May of 2020, and I want to say a little bit about it. Mary and I are involved in a number of tours with TourMagination. We lead them to places like South Africa or Switzerland, where we've been many times, 5, 6, 7, 8, it's hard to say over the years. Russia is a little bit different because we've probably been to Russia 30 and more times, just many, many times, and over many, many decades. I don't know who was president or prime minister when I went the first time, but it was a very long time ago indeed. It was Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney. That's how long ago it was. And you see a picture of that on the left. It's a picture of Mary and me in Central Asia, 1988, with our 2 kids. They're both a little bit older now, as are we. I think Mary looks more or less the same over the years. And I also am struck by this picture because when we went to the Soviet Union the first time, it was to go and study the enemy. That's how we thought of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, that it was good versus evil. And in that conflict, the Russians occupied a particular place as the center of danger and darkness. Red Square, the Kremlin, all of these things evoke that, and were you bugged or were you weren't, and so forth and so on. And then we went and lived there, and we shopped in their streets, in their stores, and stood in the same lineups. And we were struck almost from the beginning about a kind of caringness that came, and it comes in the informal ways in which you engage that society. It's important to do that because otherwise what rules our imagination is Russia, the evil empire. And we still have that impression. Russia, I always say my career has been so long in teaching in this area that Russia is back to being evil in the popular imagination in both the United States and Canada and much of Europe. There are reasons to certainly see it as a problem, but I think there is a broader picture and a broader story that's to be told that gets us beyond the stereotypes. So, what are those stereotypes? I often begin that way with students. And we talk about hockey, which many North Americans can identify with, which the Russians are big on. But then there are a lot of negative stereotypes about Russia, and Russians and vodka, and drunkenness, and kind of the collapse of society. There's that picture on the one side. And then perhaps more sinister, it's the picture of that's perhaps best exemplified by Putin, someone who early in his career and early in mine, we were almost certainly often in contact. It's a story I love to tell on our tours. My earliest encounter where his career and mine would have almost certainly intersected repeatedly. Uh, but we see that as a kind of aggression, and the Russian aggression and Russian collusion and all of the other negative stereotypes. I don't want to say that those things aren't real and don't exist, but I think it's important for us as North Americans to see it as only part of the project. You have the opportunity, if you're listening to this, to go and travel to many different countries. What I think makes travel to Russia different from many is that it's a true kind of bridge building of a country we're very, very suspicious of a people we're very, very suspicious of. We need to rethink that relationship with Russia. We need to begin to open those ties. And I think, especially with people who are Mennonites, who've heard of Mennonites, been in contact with Mennonites, uh, because it's part of our story as well. My mom was born in Ukraine, but it was all one country then. My father's father and all my forebears, I don't make sense of who I am unless I make sense of that country and that population. And so that's what we do on this tour. And the good question would be, what's different about this tour? And I think there's something that sets TourMagination tours to Russia, anywhere that Mary and I are involved with, apart from any other tour. I think in most of the tours you'll ever take, you're going to be on a tourist bus, going from tourist location to other tourist location. When you're done, you're whisked back to your tourist hotel, sit in a tourist restaurant, and spend time with other tourists. And that can be lovely. It's just not what we do. We spend about half the time viewing the big sites, and they're remarkable sites. They're big dog sites, as I often say. But then out of those sites, we go and get people out of the tourist settings and into direct encounters with Russians. I love those times. I love those times of direct engagement. And I love when I take people on tours. This happened with friends of ours about 3 years ago, who began by saying, "Oh, you can't really trust Russians. You have to be careful. They're always going to get you. You have to stay in the hotels." He was very tentative in the first couple of times he followed Mary and me around. He quickly observed the delight we have when we're out on the streets with Russians, as we do with the big sites, the big tourist sites. And within another couple of days, I chanced upon seeing him get out of the hotel one time. I was just coming back from a little walking group, and he was heading off on his own, completely at ease, completely relaxed. That marked success for me. That's what a tour looks like for us. This is an example of the world from the Russian point of view, and what you'll see, all the green and light green colors, is how NATO, that's us, have expanded constantly to the Russian borders. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about how Russia was promised when the Soviet Union collapsed that NATO would not expand east, but there it is. We'll talk about why Ukraine plays such a strategic role for Russia right now, and why, from the Russian perspective, it would be similar to how we would feel or how it would have felt in the Cold War era if Mexico would have gone under Moscow's control. Think of the excitement that was caused by Cuba. Then imagine if that would have been Mexico. And you get some feel for how the world looks from the Russian perspective. That doesn't mean you agree with Russian policy, or you may still disagree, but we have to get beyond the stereotype of good versus evil. The world's a much more complicated place than that. We know that about our own country and about our own leaders. How do you get past that? Well, we'll get people on buses and transport. Riding on a Russian bus, riding on a Russian subway is actually quite different. The way in which you get the tickets, the way in which you line up, how you get off. Is there a problem with pickpockets? Yes. Russian cities are as dangerous as any North American city, but they're also as safe. And so if people take the proper, sensible precautions that I'd recommend to anyone going for a walk anywhere, they're going to be just fine. And what they encounter are Russians who are delighted to help you, who are thrilled that you're there. Many encounters where they are delighted to meet you, and they want to work on their English with you. And especially the group that's under 30, under 40, they've got a good grasp of English, a good many of them. So you don't need to be worried in that way at all. Though many of our evening undertakings are with us as group leaders, Mary is very, very comfortable and has her own range of many stories over a long period of time. And that's part of what we'll do. We'll go to a place like this. It's called Piskarevskaya Memorial Cemetery. I won't require anyone to pronounce the name of the cemetery in order to go on the tour. It's enough to say the P word or whatever that is. Lovely setting, very horizontal. Everything's kind of flattish. At the end is this one figure that stands up. It's the most moving monument in Russia for me. And it's moving because as we walk through it, Mary and I will tell the story of the Leningrad blockade. There are 500,000 Leningraders buried in these mass graves. Putin, his brother, lies buried in this mass grave. And it would be good if we want to understand how seriously Putin takes defense to consider the fact that he has a son who's buried in a mass grave in a memorial cemetery to World War II. World War II, this was the greatest, most deadly siege in world history. Imagine that. Imagine being able to say that. And then to walk there. That might sound like a downer. It's actually not. It's a time of real engagement. Two stories that come to mind whenever I think of this place. A couple of years ago, um, we were there, and an American came up to me, and I talked about the war from the American, from the Soviet perspective, not the Canadian, not the American. And this American woman, who was such a fabulous companion on the tour, said to me, very moved, "Why are we never told those stories? Why don't we ever hear how much the Russians suffered?" They did in the 20th century. Some of that was self-inflicted. Some of it was not. And this encounter with Nazi Germany is a story worth telling. Last time when I was there, we met a young man and his son because I speak Russian. I chatted with him, and he was quite moved that we were there. There used to be tourists go there all the time. No tourists go there now. I love taking people to where tourists go. I love taking people to where tourists don't go. And it's so important to be there. He was moved by that as he was showing the place to his own son. They were from Siberia on his own pilgrimage. Then he asked me, "Why do people in the West hate us so much?" I thought it was a good question. I stumble when I try to answer. My answer was, because they don't know what Russians are like. They don't understand the world from the Russian perspective. That's what you do when you sign on to a tour like this. That's why it's important for me that people think about trying to engage in that kind of setting. So that's what we'll do. We'll go to other places. You don't just eat in tourist restaurants. We'll go to the Kremlin, whatever the Kremlin is. I've been there so often. I love asking that. And you have to have guides in the Kremlin because it's like the Smithsonian in Washington. You have to have the Smithsonian guides. But then when the tour is over at noon, we say goodbye to the tour. Then we're on our own. I love those times as much because we get to wander. People are freer to ask Mary or me questions. We don't eat in cut-off areas. You'll go to a place like this, just off Red Square, Stolovaya 57, Cafeteria 57, classic Russian food. And you can point and pick, or they actually have Russian translation there. And you're eating and lined up with other Russians. And you realize that it's safe, and you realize that you're in Russia, in the heart of Russia, and that makes it all very exciting. You're actually next door to this. This remarkable place is Red Square. I've been to Russia, as I said, too many times to count. I could go to Red Square 3 or 4 times a day. It's always different. The crowds are different. The light is different. It's different at night than at daytime. Lenin is still buried to the right. The story of Stalin is to be told because he's buried just around the corner. The cathedral at the end, which is such a stunner, you'll see a knockoff of it toward the end of my comments. I have 5 minutes left. Is a cathedral that was built in the time of Ivan the Terrible. And when you're standing there, you're standing in a place where Gorbachev, Ivan the Terrible, Lenin, Stalin, all of these people moved, and this was their front yard. We'll tell those stories. those are stories that should be of interest to anyone who was alive in the 20th century because they shaped the 20th century. Ivan the Terrible was a little bit earlier, dies in 1584. But it's also a remarkably beautiful place, and it matters particularly, again, to people who have a background in that area of coming from the Russian Empire. My life was profoundly shaped by events on this setting. They don't make sense by just going to Ukraine, though you should go to Ukraine. It has to be here. This is where it happens. I don't have a picture of a great wartime cemetery. We go to other places in cemetery in Moscow, but when we were with the group there this last time, we were the only foreigners in that cemetery. And we were at Yeltsin's grave when, stunningly, Mrs. Yeltsin came with her security detail and laid flowers at her husband's grave. And we were the only ones there, and we were 3, 4, 5 meters, about 20 feet off. Quite a moment. Moscow subway system. It's understandably the most remarkable in the world of subways. It was built at a time of great carnage in the country in the 1930s, but it was a vision. The Soviets had this vision. We might as well understand it because it had such an impact. And it's what they viewed as their new world. Those are incredible mosaics. There are 5 or 6 different subways we go. I'm guessing the Moscow subway network has about 80 subway stops. 100. It's a stunningly massive one. But the old core are remarkable. And our hotels in both cities are walkable distances. They're at the low end of cost and still quality chains and quality locations. They're wonderfully rated hotels. And they allow us to get out and walk to the key subway stops, walk to Red Square, walk to the canals of glorious St. Petersburg, and there you are. And so we'll go on our own tour. You'll be traveling with Russians. You'll get off. You'll have the chance to admire them. What makes them different? What makes them the same? Much that I could say about that. You'll go to Peterhof. There are too many palaces to count. And I'm really trying to suggest it's the big sites and it's the smaller. It's the day-to-day, the cafe, sitting in a cafe with other Russians. Peterhof was a devastated palace in World War II. The Nazis just destroy it. But there's more that happens there. Beautiful water-fed canals and fountains. There's a palace that still stands of Peter the Great. I think in May we're going to try to get in, and we're going to be in all these sites, by the way, during the greatest festivities that Russia has. It marks the end of World War II. It's really quite remarkable. We'll go there, 2 minutes. And this is a bench that's full of Russians. I have to tell you, whenever I say a bench with Russians, I always think that could be me. Those could be my parents. And they could be because it's just by some fluke that my mom was born in that land and now lives in a kilometer or a mile away from where I'm now sitting. You won't encounter those people if you stay in the tourist bus, going to tourist sites, going back to the tourist hotel. But if you will, I'll go outside of it. In each of our days in Moscow and St. Petersburg, you're going to have one free day off. On that free day, you can follow Mary or me around. There are lots we can do in either city. And we'll try to get you into these settings. And when I see people like this, I will often go and talk to them. They find it so powerful that we're there. They find it so powerful, to be honest, that someone who wasn't born there would bother to learn their language. And they lead to wonderful moments and wonderful encounters between Russians and us. Those are the kinds of encounters that I think make this remarkable. There are no sites in the world like Moscow and St. Petersburg, as they are on par with everything. But it's these informal places that I think have such meaning and such power. The last one, Cathedral of the Spilled Blood, stunningly located in St. Petersburg. All of St. Petersburg is a jewel. It was left alone by the Soviets, and so it still sits like that. Like when you're there, you would still think that Tsars are in power. There's nothing to describe the inside of this cathedral. It's 1 million mosaic stones or so. It's the story of the Bible, story of Orthodox faith, which is sort of the same and sort of different. 2 of our last walking groups just informally ended up walking by it, and it was still open. and there was evening light and dusk. We entered in. I said a few things. Mary said a few things, and then people went wandering on their own. It's unlike anything. Those are again the informal moments that happen when you can move beyond. So you're welcome to join us in May of 2020. Fabulous time of year, glorious setting. Please do join along. And even if you don't, I really do invite you to rethink what you think you know about Russia, and ask whether it's maybe not time for us and for our countries to rethink how we might engage a country with its own proud history, its own ups and downs, but one that, as the young man said to me in the cemetery in St. Petersburg, just wants to be part of a larger community of peoples and nations. Let's give them that chance. Give yourself the chance to see why it's maybe worth giving that an opportunity. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions or anything, I'm always delighted to make those personal connections with you. Thank you.
Len, thank you so much for sharing with us today your perspective and your experiences. We really appreciate that. And it's been fantastic to hear from you about what people might expect on the tour, but also how they might get a new perspective on Russia and how we could relate to them. So thank you everyone for attending the webinar, and we hope you enjoy it.
Thanks.